This is Smoky Cape in Hat Head National Park, looking north. Southwest Rocks Community Dune Care is a volunteer group that works alongside New South Wales National Parks to restore this coastline following its disturbance by sand mining in the mid-20th century. Here is a Cine Sound movie reel from 1965. The target for the miners were heavy minerals in the sand such as rutile, zircon, ilmenite and monazite. In post-World War II markets, these were very valuable, and grades as low as 1 or 2% were sufficient to make a profit. The early phases of beach stripping disturbed the beach but had little impact on the dunes. But later dredging phases were much more destructive because they necessarily involved total clearing of all vegetation before mining commenced. The Soil Conservation Service began addressing the sand drift problem as the mining effort expanded, and regrettably they developed remedies that simply aimed to bind the sand, but not to restore anything near to natural ecology. Therefore, their species selection was largely based on exotics, and Bitou bush was one of the most successful plants used, despite the fact that it had been recognised as a noxious weed in the coastal environment as early as 1909. Bitou thrives in this environment, creating a hummocky profile rather than the smooth profile induced by native vegetation. This creates vegetation islands that are at once swamped with wind-blown sand and separated by deep blowouts caused by the wind accelerating between hummocks, which in turn causes sand to blow ever further inland, often entering precious hind dune swamps. Beach traffic adds to the problem, and it also threatens shorebird breeding. The pied oystercatcher hides its eggs in plain sight, in a swale, right where a weekend warrior might be tempted to drive. This is the remains of a recently observed nest, just a scrape in the sand really. It held 2 eggs. In New South Wales, there's a monitoring program that aims to improve breeding success, which is why we're here, to see how potential hatchlings might have fared. 100 metres inland, a large Aboriginal midden has been exposed through loss of vegetation, and there is a pied oystercatcher perched on top, perhaps because the midden offers the best vantage point. The presence of an intact midden seemingly points to no mining here. However, early mining operations were generally confined to the beach and foredune, there being little profit if large quantities of sand had to be moved. There is no local knowledge of mining here, yet many of these hummocks are founded on Bitou bush, hinting at the possibility of mining rehabilitation. But they show natives too: banksia, coastal wattle, spinifex and pigface. Alan Hill recalls that about 20 years ago, Bitou was the dominant species here, with cover greater than 70%, similar to the northern section of the beach where Southwest Rocks Dune Care have done most of their work. The hummocks, in particular, were dominated by Bitou bush. He notes that the mounds are now mainly dominated by native species, with a relatively few Bitou plants remaining. So what actually happened here? The record is sparse, but Dunn's Gazette of the 2nd of October 1953 shows registration of a company called Smoky Cape Minerals Proprietary Limited in September 1953. And an article in the Macleay Argus of Friday the 4th of September 1953, Wealth in Sand at Smoky Cape, indicates work would be starting the following week with 6 men, a truck, a tractor and a special lease of 100 acres on a beach area about half a mile from Smoky Cape. This can only mean South Smoky Beach. Assuming the width of the lease to be 100 yards, a likely figure, its length would be 4,840 yards. A line 4,840 yards from Smoky Cape, as per the newspaper article, takes us to this point, and there is the midden. The earliest aerial photo we can find for South Smoky Beach is from 1967. It seems that this old track, entering the beach about 5 kilometres from the Cape, was the access route. Switching back to the 2026 aerial, this looks like a corduroy, now vegetated, built across the swampy ground before cutting through the dunes to access the beach. The 1967 aerial appears to show the high dunes sloping down to the track, consistent with sand being removed for beach access. It also shows vegetation north from this point and hints at that vegetation being in two parallel rows, but it's hard to be certain. Perhaps the best evidence for mining rehabilitation is the abrupt and almost total absence of dune vegetation south of this point, plus excellent agreement with our proposed access track 4,840 yards south of Smoky Cape, as per the newspaper article. This line of access was probably the southern boundary of the Smoky Cape Minerals sand mining lease. So mining occurred from this point north along the beach. Some attempt was made to stabilise the frontal dune, and this very likely used a species mix in which Bitou bush was the survivor. Mining must have ceased well before 1967, with this 1980 aerial showing progressive failure of the rehabilitation. The miner has extracted his profit, leaving behind a serious legacy issue. Bitou was first recorded in Australia as an herbarium specimen collected from the ballast grounds at Stockton, New South Wales in 1908. It must have been well established because it was declared noxious the next year. It was always presumed to have come from South Africa, and this was confirmed in 2023 by a paper that compared the genetics of New South Wales and African varieties, actually locating the Stockton plant's source to a specific ballast quarry in South Africa. New South Wales Soil Conservation are wholly responsible for introducing it as a plant for dune restoration. They and the Department of Mines trialled over 100 species, mostly exotic, to devise the strategy in the 1950s. Their first report about sand drift, in 1947, didn't mention Bitou and concentrated on marron grass, but subsequent reports included it all the time and described Bitou as the hardiest of all the shrubs tried, being tolerant of salt spray and wind. They also noticed even then that it created a hummocking problem when planted close to the beach because it died off on one side. Native species were only ever a small part of the rehab mix, and at one stage they even included coral trees as being useful. We need to remember that those guys were mostly agronomists, and their objective was to get ground cover quickly. They did, and we live with the consequences. The Department of Mines wrote the rehab recipe into lease conditions. The miners weren't thrilled, but by the mid-1960s they were engaging ecologists, inventing new strategies and putting more natives into the mix. In the 1970s, Australian sand miners were leading the way on rehabilitation standards and changing expectations in the whole mining industry. So whom do we blame for the present weedy mess? Miners may have done the planting, but it was required by the state, and few people in the beginning had any thought in mind about attempting to turn the dunes back to nature, whereas they did think future subdivision and tourist access was going to occur. That all changed with the SIM Committee. Areas suitable for national parks were identified, and by 1977 mining was banned in park areas. Over the next 50 years, vegetation cover slowly improved, but the Bitou expanded, becoming a menace in its own right. A single plant can produce 50,000 viable seeds in a year, so that it crowds out more desirable native plants. To bring this system back into balance, two things need to be done: reduce the dominance of Bitou and stabilise the blowouts between hummocks where high wind speeds exacerbate erosion. Today, these hummocks show Banksia and coastal wattle fringing the sand anchor of a Bitou bush, but we are reliably informed that overall there is less biota here than there was just a few years ago. Some of the Bitou is dead, and this might be due to salt spray generated by storms, but a more likely explanation is helicopter spraying of herbicide. Following discussions with national parks and observing positive results of aerial spraying around Port Macquarie, South West Rocks Dune Care agreed to incorporating limited aerial spraying in their work area. The 2022 spraying had a limited impact on Bitou bush and no discernible impact on native species. It may have been that the plants were stressed by drought, there were poor weather conditions, or some operator error. We don't know. The 2023 spray treatment proved highly effective on Bitou, with only minor damage to some native species, which soon recovered. We understand the herbicide mix used was metsulfuron-methyl at a rate equivalent to 30 grams per hectare, a relatively low application rate. The treatment was repeated in 2024 with a similar positive outcome. the 2025 follow-up treatment didn't go ahead due to National Parks and Wildlife budgetary cutbacks. A big question remains unanswered. Why was there so much bare sand on the coast long before mining? First mentions of it as a problem go back to the 1890s, and the usual explanation is fire and cattle. But there's more to this story. From 6,900 years through to 1,520 years before present, sea levels along some of Australia's east coast rose at least 1 to 2 metres above the Australian height datum, which was determined from 1966 to 1968 observations. That higher sea was 2 degrees centigrade warmer, and there was a relatively benign northeast wind regime delivering sand coastwards. Subsequent sea level retreat exposed that sand to a different southeast wind regime, and it blew inland. Over time, these fresh dunes were probably well vegetated, but a series of droughts post-1788, especially the Federation drought of 1895 to 1903, saw severe overgrazing. Coincident were a massive rabbit plague and bushfires. A perfect storm, in other words. Aboriginal people would have experienced all of this. Undoubtedly, they too sat high on this midden, probably over millennia, eating shellfish and other bush foods, watching their children play, just as today the pied oystercatcher watches over its 2 chicks. It seems the nest was successful, and so too, we hope, the shorebird breeding program. To sum up, South West Rocks Dune Care and National Parks New South Wales have pretty well eliminated Bitou bush from the town of South West Rocks down the entire length of the Smoky Range to the lighthouse at Smoky Cape, which you can see in the distance, and then another 3 kilometres south towards this point, restoring native vegetation and supporting native fauna like the pied oystercatcher. But South West Rocks Dune Care cannot walk this far, so who is going to do the job? It appears to me that the best and possibly only practical solution is to massively support and expand the volunteer movement, and South West Rocks Community Dune Care is a prime example of an efficient environmental community group delivering important results. Governments need to support groups like this.
Maybe 3 metres taller, 2.4 metres tall. They can tap into the moisture down low, and so the other plants who have only got a shallow root system haven't really got a chance against it. And then it immediately starts to spread out across the ground, so it shades the ground, and most of the plants that grow in these dunes want sunlight. So it's getting moisture from low down, and then you end up shading out everything else.
South West Rocks Community Dune Care has received significant financial support from the New South Wales Environmental Trust to carry out its work and, more recently, from local Land Service New South Wales.